By the summer of 1944, the Red Army stood on the threshold of Eastern Europe. Behind them lay 3 years of devastation. The ruins of Stalingrad, the frozen forests of Leningrad, the scorched fields of Kursk. Ahead lay lands that had suffered under German occupation since 1941: Poland, Belarus, the Baltics, Ukraine, and the Balkans. Entire nations waited in silence, hoping liberation would arrive before annihilation. The Soviet advance began not as a march of triumph, but as a storm forged in suffering. Millions of civilians had been killed by the retreating Wehrmacht. Villages were burned, cities mined, roads booby-trapped. As the Red Army crossed the old Soviet border near Brest, soldiers saw ghost towns. Wells poisoned, children orphaned, churches turned into bunkers. Liberation would not be a parade. It would be a fight for the soul of a continent. Behind the front, Stalin and the Stavka planned a sequence of massive offensives: Bagration in Belarus, Lvov-Sandomierz in Ukraine, the push toward the Vistula, and the northern strikes toward the Baltic states. Each was designed not only to destroy German armies, but to collapse their system of occupation. For Soviet soldiers, crossing into Eastern Europe felt like stepping onto sacred ground, a place of both vengeance and responsibility. Every kilometer reclaimed carried a message. The war was no longer about survival alone. It was about ending a darkness that had consumed half of Europe. The liberation of Belarus began like a thunderclap. Operation Bagration smashed through German Army Group Center, sending entire divisions into chaos. The Soviets advanced through swamps, forests, and destroyed villages that had endured some of the worst horrors of the occupation. Here, the German policy of scorched earth had turned whole regions into wastelands. 600 villages burned with their inhabitants, thousands executed in public squares, cities reduced to rubble. As Soviet troops entered places like Vitebsk, Orsha, and Bobruisk, they found survivors emerging from forests and cellars, blinded by daylight. Some wept. Others stared silently at the soldiers, unable to believe the nightmare was ending. Partisan units who had fought for years in the shadows now surfaced with flags held high, guiding Soviet tank brigades through hidden forest paths and mined roads. By July 3, 1944, Minsk fell. The Red Army captured over 100,000 German soldiers and uncovered evidence of mass killings, concentration camps, and destroyed Jewish communities. The liberation of Belarus was a moment of both triumph and grief. A nation saved, yet unimaginably scarred. But the advance did not pause. Eastern Europe was opening like a corridor of shattered empires, and the Soviets were moving at a pace the world had never seen. Crossing into Poland, Soviet soldiers entered a land where liberation was tangled with tragedy. The Germans had turned Poland into the central hub of genocide: Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, Sobibor. As the Red Army approached these places, German forces tried to erase the evidence, burning documents, destroying chambers, murdering remaining prisoners. But it was too late. In July 1944, Soviet troops reached Majdanek, the first major concentration camp liberated in the war. What they found defied comprehension. Barracks filled with corpses, gas chambers still intact, piles of shoes and human ashes several meters high. The world would soon see the photographs. Liberation was no longer a military act. It had become a moral verdict. Yet Poland was also a political minefield. The Soviet Union and the Polish Home Army both sought to free Warsaw, but mistrust ran deep. While the Red Army approached the Vistula, The Warsaw Uprising erupted, and Germany responded with monstrous brutality. The Soviets halted on the riverbank, their troops exhausted and stretched thin from months of constant fighting, while the city burned. For ordinary Polish civilians, the arrival of Soviet soldiers meant salvation from a nightmare, but also uncertainty about the future. Liberation and destiny now walked together, step by step, into a fragile new world. In the north, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, became the site of some of the fiercest battles of the Soviet advance. The Germans called it the Northern Fortress, a last bastion meant to shield East Prussia. For 3 years, the Baltic peoples had lived under brutal occupation, mass executions, deportations, forced labor, and the annihilation of entire Jewish communities. The Soviet offensive struck with overwhelming force. The First Baltic Front swept through Lithuania, capturing Vilnius in July 1944 after house-to-house fighting. In Latvia, the battles around Daugavpils and Riga turned cities into burning labyrinths. Estonian resistance fighters secretly guided Soviet troops through forests, while German units tried to retreat toward the Courland Peninsula. As Soviet soldiers liberated towns, they found streets lined with survivors waving homemade flags, but also empty ghettos, destroyed synagogues, and long trenches filled with victims. The scars of occupation were everywhere, carved into the land and into the people. By autumn, the Baltic region was largely free, though the German army in Courland continued fighting until the war's final days. The Soviets had broken the northern wall of Nazi Europe and opened the path to East Prussia. While Soviet forces pushed across the northern front, the Balkans shook under the weight of a political earthquake. In August 1944, the Red Army approached the Romanian border. Romania, a German ally since 1941, had contributed hundreds of thousands of troops to the invasion of the Soviet Union. But now, with Soviet armies at the gates and German defeat looming, the country reached a breaking point. On August 23rd, King Michael launched a coup, arresting the pro-Nazi dictator Ion Antonescu and declaring Romania's switch to the Allied side. The German response was immediate: air raids, sabotage, and attempts to seize Bucharest. Soviet troops advanced rapidly, linking up with Romanian units that had turned their guns on the Wehrmacht. What followed was a swift, violent reversal. In days, the Germans were driven out of southern Romania. Soviet mechanized corps surged through the Carpathians, cutting off German retreat routes and capturing tens of thousands of soldiers. Romania's defection collapsed Hitler's entire southern flank. Oil fields at Ploiești, Germany's last major fuel source, fell into Soviet hands. The liberation of Romania reshaped the course of the Eastern Front and opened the road to Bulgaria and Hungary. By early September 1944, the Soviet advance into the Balkans created political shockwaves. Bulgaria, though technically a German ally, had never sent troops to fight the USSR, but it had allowed German forces to use its territory, and that was enough to place the country in Stalin's sights. As Soviet armies approached the Danube, Bulgaria faced a decision that would define its future. The government attempted neutrality, withdrawing from the war against the Allies and declaring a desire for peace. But neutrality was impossible with German divisions retreating through its borders and the Red Army preparing to cross the river. On September 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Bulgaria, and the following day, a sudden, bloodless revolution erupted in Sofia. The new Fatherland Front government immediately aligned with the Allies and declared war on Germany. German units in the Balkans were stunned. Overnight, a former partner had become an enemy. Soviet and Bulgarian troops began joint operations, cutting off German escape routes in Macedonia and Greece. For ordinary Bulgarians, the liberation was confusing, chaotic, and swift. But it spared the nation the full devastation that had consumed much of Eastern Europe. A country once on the wrong side of history had pivoted in a single moment, reshaping the map of the Balkans. Hungary was different. Unlike Romania or Bulgaria, it refused to abandon Hitler. Its leadership believed that surrendering to the Soviets would mean national extinction. So Hungary dug in and became the scene of some of the bloodiest battles of the Eastern Front's final phase. In the fall of 1944, the Red Army crossed the Carpathians and poured into Hungarian plains. German and Hungarian units resisted fiercely, turning towns into fortresses. Budapest became the heart of this struggle, a city Hitler demanded be held to the last bullet. As Soviet troops advanced, the Arrow Cross fascist regime launched mass executions of Jews and political prisoners. The Danube turned red with the bodies of the murdered. Soviet soldiers who entered the city saw horror on a scale that shocked even veterans of Stalingrad. The siege of Budapest lasted from December 1944 to February 1945. Street by street, building by building, the Red Army fought a brutal urban war against elite German SS divisions. When the city finally fell, it was reduced to ruins, bridges destroyed, districts burned, its people starving. The liberation of Hungary came at a terrible cost, but it broke the last major German stronghold in the Balkans. As the Red Army pushed westward, the mountains of Slovakia rose like a natural fortress. Here, German forces and local collaborators prepared a desperate defense, but resistance was already growing from within. In August 1944, the Slovak national uprising erupted. Tens of thousands of Slovak soldiers, partisans, and civilians took up arms, declaring independence from Nazi control. They seized towns, sabotaged German transports, and held key passes while waiting for the Red Army to break through the Carpathians. But the mountains slowed the Soviet advance, and German SS units counterattacked with brutality. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned. Civilians were executed in public squares. The uprising fought on, even as its fighters were forced into forests and caves. When Soviet forces finally pierced the mountain passes in early 1945, they found a land scarred by repression, but unbroken in spirit. Survivors of the uprising joined the advancing Red Army, guiding them through hidden valleys and dangerous terrain. The liberation of Slovakia became not only a military victory, but a testament to the resilience of a nation that refused to bow to tyranny. Yugoslavia was unlike any other battleground in Eastern Europe. Here, resistance had grown into a full-scale army long before the Soviets arrived. Led by Josip Broz Tito, the Yugoslav partisans controlled mountains, forests, and entire regions, liberated zones defended by their own government, hospitals, and military command. When the Red Army crossed into Serbia in September 1944, they found not a defeated population, but an armed nation. Soviet and Yugoslav forces joined in a massive offensive to free Belgrade. German garrisons fought fiercely, turning bridges and factories into fortresses, but they were overwhelmed by the combined assault. On October 20th, Belgrade was liberated. Civilians lined the streets shouting Slava as Soviet tanks rolled past and partisan fighters embraced their long-awaited allies. But Yugoslavia's liberation was unique. Where the Soviets liberated, Tito governed. The country's future would belong not to Moscow, but to a fiercely independent movement forged in years of mountain warfare. Eastern Europe was being freed, but each nation carried its own story, its own scars, and its own destiny. As 1944 turned to 1945, the Red Army approached the heart of Hitler's empire. East Prussia, the symbolic birthplace of German militarism, now lay within reach. Here, German forces prepared for a final stand, fighting not only for territory, but for the illusion that the Reich could still be saved. Soviet soldiers advancing through Poland saw the full scale of Nazi brutality: abandoned camps, mass graves, burned villages, skeletal survivors. Liberation turned into revelation, and revelation into fury. In January 1945, Operation East Prussia began. Soviet armies stormed across frozen lakes, forests, and fortified towns. German civilians fled in caravans across icy roads, many dying in snowstorms or under artillery fire. The Wehrmacht fought with desperation, but each German counterattack shattered against the weight of Soviet armor and artillery. By the end of the month, Soviet forces had surrounded Königsberg and cut off the entire region. East Prussia, once a symbol of German pride, was now a pocket of ruins and fear. The liberation of Eastern Europe was reaching its final act. The Red Army stood on the doorstep of Germany itself. As the Red Army swept across the Vistula, Poland became the crucible of liberation and tragedy. The country had endured 5 years of terror, executions, ghettos, mass deportations, and the systematic destruction of its cities. Now, in 1944-45, Soviet troops approached lands soaked in unimaginable suffering. Yet Poland's liberation was tangled with politics. The Polish Home Army, AK, loyal to a government in exile in London, launched the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944, hoping to free the capital before the Soviets arrived. For 63 days, they fought alone, street by street, house by house, against German armor, artillery, and airstrikes that leveled entire districts. Across the Vistula River, Soviet armies halted. The Red Army watched as Warsaw bled, citing exhaustion and logistical delays. In reality, Stalin had already decided Poland's political destiny, and an independent uprising did not fit his plans. When Soviet troops finally entered the ruined capital in January 1945, they found a dead city, 85% destroyed, its population scattered or slaughtered. Yet throughout Poland, villagers greeted their liberators with tears and bread, grateful that the nightmare of Nazi occupation was ending. For Poland, liberation came, but it came alongside a new kind of uncertainty. The land that had suffered most would now rebuild under a different shadow. To the north, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, became the battleground of one of the final German strongholds on the Eastern Front. Army Group North, trapped along the Baltic coastline, refused to surrender. Hitler declared the region a fortress and demanded that it be held to the last man. The Red Army attacked through forests, marshlands, and ancient cities. Riga fell after brutal street fighting. Tallinn's defenders were pushed toward the sea, evacuating under the protection of the Kriegsmarine. Civilians fled in panic, caught between retreating German forces and advancing Soviet armies. In Lithuania, the battle for Kaunas raged for days. In Latvia, entire forests became partisan war zones as anti-German and anti-Soviet fighters clashed in the shadows. The Baltic nations were being torn apart by two empires, one dying, one rising. By early 1945, the last survivors of Army Group North were isolated on the Courland Peninsula, refusing surrender even as the Reich itself collapsed. For the Red Army, the Baltic liberation was a symbol. No corner of Nazi Europe would escape judgment. For the Baltics, it was a moment of both liberation and the beginning of another long struggle for independence. As spring 1945 approached, the Red Army surged into Czechoslovakia. Here, the war took on a desperate, chaotic character. German forces retreating from Poland and Hungary turned Prague into a fortress. SS units dug trenches in fields and forests, preparing for a final stand. But the Czech people were no longer passive. Underground resistance groups sabotaged rail lines, attacked German convoys, and distributed weapons. By May, Prague itself was ready to rise. When the Prague uprising erupted on May 5th, the city transformed into a battlefield. Barricades rose overnight. Civilians captured weapons from fleeing troops. Fighting erupted in squares and alleys. German forces retaliated with brutal shelling. On May 9th, Soviet tanks of the First Ukrainian Front rolled into the burning city. Civilians flooded the streets, cheering, crying, embracing soldiers still covered in dust from the road to Berlin. The liberation of Czechoslovakia marked one of the final chapters of the war in Europe, a moment of triumph overshadowed by the enormous human cost. By late April 1945, the Red Army reached the Oder River, the last great natural barrier before Berlin. Across the water lay the heart of Nazi Germany, guarded by surviving SS units, Hitler Youth battalions, and last-ditch Volkssturm militias. The Soviets prepared for their ultimate assault. Artillery pieces stretched for miles. Engineers built pontoon bridges under fire. Tanks and infantry packed the riverbanks, waiting for the final order. As dawn broke, the world shook. Thousands of guns unleashed a barrage that turned the far bank into fire and dust. Soviet infantry crossed in waves, fighting through trenches and ruins. German defenders resisted with suicidal ferocity, knowing there was nowhere left to retreat. Every mile toward Berlin cost hundreds of lives. Yet the Red Army marched on, driven not only by duty, but by memory. Stalingrad, Leningrad, Kiev, Minsk, Warsaw. Every life lost was carried with them across the Oder. The gateway to Berlin was open. The final act had arrived. By May 1945, Eastern Europe was free, but at a cost beyond measure. Cities lay in ashes, villages were emptied, millions were dead or displaced. The Red Army had liberated half a continent, but every kilometer of ground had been paid for with blood. From the Baltic to the Balkans, civilians embraced Soviet soldiers as liberators. Yet liberation also brought new realities, new governments, new borders, and a new world order shaped in Moscow, Washington, and London. For the Soviet Union, victory was both triumph and tragedy. 27 million lives had been lost. Entire regions had been burned to the ground. But from that sacrifice emerged a force powerful enough to crush the Reich and reshape Europe. The liberation of Eastern Europe was not a single moment. It was a storm of fire, sacrifice, and hope. A march that began in the ruins of Stalingrad ended with the fall of Berlin. And the lesson left behind was clear. Freedom is never given. It is taken at a price the world must never forget.